So far, we've looked at Hobbes and Rousseau. And Hobbes and Rousseau both offered us oppositional pictures of what human nature is like, therefore what the state of nature is going to be like, and whether government and society and these social and economic institutions that we have, whether they've been good for us. As we saw in the last two lectures, Hobbes has what you might call a realistic or pessimistic view of human nature. He doesn't think that humans are naturally evil, but he thinks that because we are self-interested beings, fundamentally motivated by feelings and passion, that the state of nature would not be a great place. Because we are rational, we would realize and therefore utilize violence in achieving our ends if we have to. And so he has a, how should we put it? Not optimistic, but positive view of government, the institution of private property, rights, the demands we can place on the government, and all that kind of stuff. Rousseau offered us a different picture. Rousseau said, no, human beings are actually naturally good and cooperative. We could call this the optimistic view of human nature. And what we saw in his philosophy is the implication that the reason why people suck today is because of this system that we have built that has influenced us. Our social and economic institutions, more particularly the institution of private property, have corrupted us. And so now we are kind of awful people that care about these things. We have these artificial needs and desires for things we don't really need. And that has caused us over time to become weaker, meaner, perhaps more stupid, and all of the rest. Well, that's all fine and good, but obviously that's not the complete picture, right? Humans are social and political beings. There are other animals that are social beings, right? Bees, ants, they live together in communities. They have certain roles that they occupy and carry out. But according to ancient philosophers and a lot of modern philosophers and contemporary thinkers today, humans may be special in that they are political beings. Well, maybe you could argue some other animals have their own political systems, rudimentary political systems. But Aristotle, way back when, argued that it is our capacity for speech and rational thought that allows us to come together and form political institutions and organize ourselves in certain ways. What is very interesting about humans is that in a very radical way, we construct the environments that retroactively influence our lives. Things like language, social and economic systems, norms, religion, ideology, culture, architecture. These are all things that have some kind of influence on how we see the world and therefore how we move and act within it. And so the question that we're going to try to answer today is, what kind of environment should we construct for ourselves? How should we organize ourselves socially and economically? What characteristics should the environment that we create together through cooperation and mutual effort, what should that be like? In the piece that I asked you to read, Sell discusses various political ideologies that humans have come up with over the millennia. It is these ideologies that have undergirded the social and economic systems that we've constructed around the globe that have influenced those environments in which we live. He defines an ideology as follows: a descriptive and prescriptive view about, quote, how the world is and how it ought to be. See, ever since we started coming together in society, we've been talking about, well, how should we live amongst one another? What kinds of rules and laws should we instantiate? What kinds of social and political and economic institutions should we live by and hold each other to? Ideologies can help us understand and see the world in certain lights, compare systems, change things, make progress, all that good stuff. But if we regard an ideology as like a frame or a lens through which we view the world, there are obviously some dangers with that. Ideologies can harm us. They can maintain closed-mindedness. So, what I want to present to you today is a bunch of different ideologies. And I want you to think of these as, again, different lenses or tools. I told you at the beginning of this class that I'm not trying to tell you what I think, what my personal views are about the world and how everything works, and what everything is like and how it should be. Think of these as, well, different ways of socio-economic organization. Compare them, weigh them, personally reflect on which one or ones you think are good, and which one or ones you'd like to instantiate in the world. In any case, the reason why we're looking at this is because it's critical for our lives. Our actions do not occur in a vacuum, right? Our actions have consequences on other people. And insofar as we are members of society, it would be a good idea for us all to get clear on, well, what kind of impact do we want to have on it? What do we want it to be like? That's what ideology is trying to describe for us. Ideology mobilizes and organizes people, Sell says, prescribes specific actions and behaviors, justifies these actions as serving a higher calling or a greater good, normally, and critiques alternative ways of looking at things. Each ideology gives us a set of beliefs and behaviors that help us navigate political life. Okay, any questions so far? We good? Okay, so why don't we talk about these things then? I have a few different ideologies written on the board here. Again, I'm not going to write everything down that I have written personally down, and I'm going to use a little bit of shorthand to fit the information into these squares. But these are just a few of the ideologies that we humans have come up with over the years that might help organize our actions, our perceptions, and our living together. I don't have them all listed, right? There are way more ideologies than these, but these seem to be the most popular, as far as I can tell. So we'll just start at the top. Classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is a political ideology that, according to Leo Strauss, has been around since ancient times in various forms. But the kind that you are probably most familiar with, the classical kind, is the one that emerged during the modern period due to thinkers like Mill and Locke and the Founding Fathers. Thus, it has come to have a huge influence on the development of an American society in history. It forms the basis of American politics today and has since our founding. And it has certain characteristics that we can all recognize. We could call it a social ideology. It's an ideology about how we should organize ourselves socially. And it's one which relies on markets for economic decision making and democratic institutions through voting for political decision making. It's an ideology which emphasizes individual rights, tries to protect and safeguard those, and it thinks that, by and large, the role of the government should be to rule for the good of the people. Oftentimes, classical liberals will say that there should be certain checks and limits placed on government. And as you probably know, a lot of classical liberals, especially the Founding Fathers, defended people's right to overthrow their government if it was no longer serving them or if it was not ruling for their good. Now, the kind of social, economic, and political institutions we have in the U.S. are kind of a blend of socialist policies and classically liberal policies. Although we might also say that there are some policies that are leaning also towards conservatism and progressivism, depending on which domains of political life you're looking at. In any case, it's one that emphasizes freedom and liberty, and generally, in a general sense, power is not centralized in some huge, vast, totalitarian government, but is instantiated in the will of the people. Now, what are the strengths and weaknesses with this ideology? Well, all you have to do is kind of reflect on your own life to see this. In our country, we value individual liberties and rights. In that sense, it provides freedom to people. I mean, just compare our country with North Korea or China, which has a social credit system. We don't have that. By and large, we can decide how we want to live, what we want to do, what life path we want to follow. We have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And generally, we think this is a good thing, right? We like people being able to decide what they want to do as long as they're not harming or violating the rights of others. Historically, we can say it's also associated with the generation of wealth. Compared to a lot of other nations, we are wealthy. We have a lot of crap. We produce a lot of stuff. Generally speaking, our nation has a lot of money. Maybe we don't have a lot of money. I certainly don't. But compared to other countries, we have a lot. Finally, we can say, perhaps a strength of it, although maybe you'll see this as a weakness, is that generally the power resides in the people, in the indirect formation of policy and law. If we don't like how things are going, we can vote in new representatives who will rule on our behalf. We don't have a pure democracy in the U.S. We have what might be called a constitutional, democratic, representative republic. And so it's not as if all law and policy is just determined by whatever gets the most votes among the people. We elect representatives who then, make decisions about things for us. And historically, it's worked out well for many people. Didn't really work out that well for those that we decimated in order to take over this country. And certainly there's inequality in our system. But when we compare our social and economic development to other countries, well, we're doing pretty well. Now, what are the weaknesses with this ideology? Well, as I just mentioned, there's inequality. There's an unequal distribution of wealth. Because our nation is capitalistic, it pushes, advocates for, and has enshrined, kind of in the way that we do things, the private ownership of goods and services and the means of production. What we've seen, especially in the last few decades, is vast amounts of wealth accumulating in the hands of very few people, right? And this is what our system allows. So, I mean, inequality is obviously a bad thing, right? We don't want people to be in poverty. You might even say freedom is a double-edged sword, because by giving people freedom, you're giving them the opportunity to make their own lives worse and ruin them. But generally, we still think freedom is a good thing. Liberal countries like ours have difficulty dealing with problems that are caused by the market, such as pollution and environmental degradation. Because we can all kind of decide how we want to live and what we want to do, there seems to be this tendency now that the rights and liberties that we have give us freedom and opportunities, but we've seemingly lost the sense that with freedom and opportunities comes certain obligations. So, we have companies and corporations producing all of these things that we consume, and we like that generally because we like our laptops and our iPhones. But what's happening as a result? Well, again, pollution, environmental degradation. Who's on the hook for that? Well, liberal countries have a hard time dealing with the problems that are caused by decisions having to do with the market and production and consumption. Finally, because classical liberalism does value the rights and liberties of the individual, you could say it's kind of an individualistic ideology. You might say one of its weaknesses is it has difficulty with mobilizing the people in dealing with these problems in the formation of law and policy. In our country, by and large, we have a two-party system. And if the surveys are correct, we've never been more politically polarized ever. Thus, even though a lot of us can recognize that there are real problems with how we are doing things, it's hard to get everybody on board because we have fostered this environment and this idea that the individual is paramount and their needs and concerns should be prioritized over our collective issues and problems. Okay, classical liberalism. A great example of this would be in the US. What about capitalism? What is that? What kind of system would you call it? Not social, but thinking of an E word? Right, yeah. Let's call it economic. Does anybody know which thinkers are associated with this ideology? There's one big one that Sell mentions. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. Yeah.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith, yeah, exactly. Who else helped formulate or support capitalism?
I don't know if it was necessarily formulate, but a really big one was Ayn Rand.
Yeah, right, with her objectivism, right? We can say Ayn Rand. Some of the other free market thinkers, I think Hayek and von Mises fit in here too. Well, what is capitalism? What kind of ideology is it? What does it say? What does it prescribe?
This specifically is in very few actual, written down admittance of philosophers for capitalism, but it tends to be just the rule of whoever has the most money or whoever can produce the most money is whoever can control the economic system in general.
That's kind of what it ends up being, right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if we're going to contrast it with some of the other ideologies that we'll be talking about today, socialism, communism, we could say it's an economic system that's centered around private ownership of capital. So property, goods, services. And it's aimed towards the generation of wealth and profit. So it's a system designed to produce wealth and profit in some sense. Well, what are the strengths with it? Does it produce wealth and profit?
I'd say the benefits of early capitalism are it produces the innovation, wealth. In newly capitalist states, it usually produces actual trickle-down economics that might work.
Oh. Yeah, so maybe one of you might say if it is instantiated properly, and maybe you would lump in there should be certain regulations on the market and buying and selling and stuff like this. Yeah, maybe a trickle-down effect does occur. I'm not going to write that down, but maybe, yeah. So yeah, it encourages and produces innovation. It generates wealth. Does it do anything else? Think back to the Powell piece and compare how we are living now to how people in the U.S. lived 100 years ago. This might not be true for all people, but generally speaking, it raises the standard of living of a country, at least for some. And these things are good, right? We want higher standards of living. Wealth and profit is good. Innovation is good. It allows us to tackle these complex problems more efficiently. Produces all these consumer goods that we love, right? Who doesn't love the show Love is Blind? Or Down for Love? Or the new live action Avatar, right? The Boys. Yeah, so it produces a lot of stuff. What are its weaknesses? It might have some things in common, right, with liberalism. What are its weaknesses?
Well, like overconsumption can be a huge thing.
Sure.
And that kind of goes along with like inflation, like with supply and demand.
Yeah, maybe we could even make this more general. Yeah, we do live these consumerist lives, don't we? At least a lot of people in the U.S. do. Because we have all this stuff. Maybe you could say it leads to like moral degradation, or something like that. I don't know. Do people become better people within capitalist systems? You might think, no, people become greedier, meaner, embody more of a scarcity mindset. I don't know. So I'll write that down, moral degradation. What else can happen as a result of these companies and corporations making more and more and more money?
It goes with inequality, but maybe you have a better term, but like just like, let's say like 5 big companies holding all of the wealth from like everyone.
Yeah. Monopolization.
Yeah.
I'll just abbreviate it. I don't want to write it all out. Yeah. Something that we've seen throughout history is as these companies and corporations produce more and generate more wealth for themselves, they come to dominate the market, which then exacerbates social and economic issues. Yeah. People have varying opinions about whether or not capitalism has been a net good. People like Hicks and Levin and some other free market thinkers are going to say it has been a net good for sure. And then you'll have, for example, a lot of progressives nowadays, communists like Marx, who will just rail against it, right? And say it produces this oppression, this alienation, and all of this inequality. Maybe that's something that we could write down too. When we talk about Marxist communism, alienation. Okay, good. Yeah. Let's get a little bit more specific now about liberalism. In the context of the United States, there are these ideologies, and they differ, right, in other parts of the world. But we have this thing called the right-left divide, which emerged due to the French Revolution and what was going on during that time period. And generally what's associated with that are the positions of conservatism and progressivism. So, who are some conservative thinkers that you know? Do you know any conservative thinkers? You're like, no, I don't listen to conservative media at all. From our perspective, you might call the Founding Fathers conservative, right? Although what they were doing was rather progressive and radical for their time. You can just look at some of the, media nowadays and see who the conservative thinkers are. I think Benjamin Powell is a conservative, generally speaking, free market conservative. Maybe it would be easier to list progressivist thinkers. Who are the progressivist thinkers nowadays?
I feel like this is wrong, but could technically Elon Musk be?
Yeah, it depends on how we define progressivism, right?
Yeah.
What are we trying to progress? What do progressives care about? Well, generally speaking, nowadays they care about this thing called social justice, equity, reducing inequality, eliminating alienation and oppression. We might say that those who are progressively minded have a disposition or tendency to reform and change and innovate our political system because they see the flaws within it and they want to get rid of those flaws. Whereas conservatives think that we should value the traditions and wisdom of the past. We shouldn't rush into changing and reforming things unnecessarily because some things have been working for a while, so there might be certain norms and policies, structures and institutions that we want to conserve, that we don't want to change. I'm going to say, at least in the U.S., in the context of American liberalism, that's what this stands for, we could call the critical theorists progressivist. People like, I don't know, Herbert Marcuse. Who else? You might consider Bell Hooks a progressive. Kimberly Crenshaw. Other critical theorists nowadays. Yeah, generally speaking, the kinds of progressivism that we have today is very critical of our liberal capitalist system. Nowadays, what we see a lot is not the pushing for equality of opportunity, you might say, if we can contrast that with equality of outcome. Right? Equity, that's the word that's often used. I'm sure you've heard these words: diversity, equity, inclusion. That's associated with critical theory and, in the U.S., progressivism. We might call it, both of these, social ideologies. They're ideologies about how we should organize ourselves socially, the kinds of values, priorities, and policies that we should have. Yeah?
I feel like when I think of like progressive thinkers or people, like, I guess like I just feel like they value like science a lot more, and, like technology. Like that's kind of why like Elon Musk came to my mind, because it's like conservative thinkers kind of want to keep things, like you said, like traditional or like the way that they are, and like we have like a lot of thinkers nowadays that I feel like are just trying to like get the next best whatever, the next best technology, the next best.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So at least in the context of the U.S., right? Those who are conservative tend to be religious, Christian. Those who tend to be progressive tend to champion, I don't know. Not all of them are atheists. Not all of them are like, woohoo, science, because there is a real critique that the critical theorists, for example, level against the Enlightenment ideals of rationality and reason and the scientific method. But if we look, for example, at how people talked about COVID and felt about COVID, you might say by and large these people were saying you got to follow the science. Although, I mean, things are not this simple, right? Not all conservatives are fundamentalist Christians. Not all progressives are like, the champions of science. But yeah, I mean, we're painting in broad strokes here, right? Let's talk about their strengths and weaknesses. What strengths are there with conservatism? I know it might be hard, but I'm sure you can think of some. Even if you're not conservative yourself. As a strength?
No.
I mean, maybe some people would see that as a strength. I don't know. Strengths, though. Strengths. Say it louder. Individual right? Yeah, I mean, generally what you see is conservatives nowadays, at least in the U.S., they are pretty happy and encouraging with respect to some of the foundational ideas of classical liberalism, right? Rights, the right to private property, get off my lawn, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so maybe we could say, yeah, they care about preserving certain institutions and policies and laws. So maybe we could say, yeah, they want to protect our rights to, I don't know, own guns, practice the religion we want to practice, say what we want, screw the man, big government, yeah.
Maybe not in practice, but in the actual core beliefs of what conservatism is, keeping up with law and legal aspects.
Oh, say more about that. What do you mean?
I think now current conservatives really are oh, we're the party of law and order, whatever.
Ah, okay.
But I think not necessarily in today's practice of law and order, but in their core principles, I think a strength is following societal's rules of law and order.
Ah, okay. Yeah. If we're going to follow Hobbes, law and order is a good thing. It's not just a good show. Right? Yeah, generally we want people following the laws. That's good. It prevents conflict and all these bad things from breaking out, sure. Maybe we could say a strength of this ideology is it emphasizes caution with regards to changing our laws and policies. Maybe that's good, Maybe they have a point in saying we shouldn't just rush to change things all the time because we don't know what the hell we're doing a lot of times and we're stupid. Yeah, anything else? Maybe we should write cautious here. Cautious? Is that how you spell it? Anything else? Maybe we could say, in some small way, they are correct in saying we should pay attention and heed tradition, what our ancestors did. Maybe they weren't all wrong. So you could say maybe there is some wisdom and knowledge to be found in the past. Maybe it's a strength that it's past looking, and maybe you'd say that's a weakness as well. Saying we should preserve, in some sense, the way that we did things or thought about things, because look, it worked for a long time for a lot of people, and we shouldn't just get rid of it willy-nilly. Okay, what about weaknesses? Say that again?
The people that they emphasize it was working for a long time. It was a very specific group of people it was working for.
Yeah, let's generalize that. If we're just trying to conserve everything, that can fail to address real social and economic issues, right? And what goes along with that is, maybe you might say conservatism sometimes conserves the wrong or bad things about a system. Yeah, so obviously there's still inequality today, right? And depending on how you feel about COVID or other issues, you might say trying to conserve people's individual right to freedom of movement and assembly was a bad thing. You could say that. What else? You mentioned sexism earlier. I'll kind of lump that under that. If I could spell. Wait, is that right now? I don't know. Whatever. What else? What are some weaknesses with conservatism?
Mixing church and state.
Okay, so yeah, so you think there should be a separation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. What do contemporary conservatives believe? Do they think that we should live in a theocracy? Maybe. Yeah.
I don't think contemporary conservatives think that, but I also think that contemporary conservatives get lumped in with what is being currently coined as Trump Republicans.
Okay. And that's a weakness?
I mean, I think it's a weakness. I just don't think it's necessarily conservatism.
Okay.
I think it's like a radical belief of people that identify themselves as conservatives, but I don't think it's actual conservatism.
Okay. Yeah,
I think
and
the weakness there is that ideology attracts those kind of people.
okay. Yeah, I mean, we kind of covered a lot with this, right? Fails to address issues that are within the system. It may, in a similar vein, uphold various isms, racism, sexism, inequality, right? Yeah.
I know this is kind of the same, but inhibits social progress.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, we'll write that down. And there are obviously, right, there are a lot more strengths and weaknesses to all of these ideologies than just what we're listing here. This is what we're coming up with on the fly. What about progressivism? What are its strengths? Well, I suppose we could look at some of the weaknesses of conservatism, right? Because they are kind of oppositional ideologies in a way in the U.S. You could say it seeks to address social issues. We'll just say issues because it's not just social but also economic. Yeah, what else?
It makes people's lives easier, like in the sense of like technology, like the advancements that we've made to like different sciences or technology to make us do less work, I guess.
It seeks to engage in social and economic progress that's kind of associated with the first point, right? I mean, think about how our morals and values have changed within the last few decades. For example, homosexuality used to be considered a mental disorder, right? And now we're having the same discussions about, people who are non-binary, trans, this kind of stuff. So we might say, in relation to those two, it fosters acceptance, or tries to. Maybe you would say that progressives aren't doing a good job of this, but that's what it's trying to do, right? I don't know what y'all think and believe, But the idea that is being pushed generally nowadays, right, is like, look, let people be who they are. Let them do what they want to do. Why do you care about that? It doesn't matter. Let people live how they want to live, right? And that way, it's kind of libertarian. Okay, what are its weaknesses? It's not cautious. Maybe we could, if we're being, if we're trying to be charitable to the conservative position, maybe we would call it rash. Okay, what else? There are people who argue that progressivism contributes to moral degradation, right? You'll hear conservatives say this. Oh, look at what our country is becoming, right? We can't let children play outside anymore. You could say that. Not sure if you believe it. I don't know what the hell I believe, so. In any case, it does change or modify norms and policies. And that might be good in some domains, but in other domains it might not be good. There's a strong push within the last few years to defund and eliminate police departments. In some places that ended up biting these communities in the butt because crime shot up. That didn't happen everywhere, but you might see that as a weakness. Like, no, we need law enforcement. Anything else? A lot of these strengths and weaknesses are going to be dependent on like what your personal beliefs are and what your values are. There's a real strand of progressivism that is anti-liberal in the sense of classical liberalism, right?
Like you mean like with the Constitution and everything? Like thinking we need to like rewrite?
The Constitution, speech laws. There's been a lot of talk nowadays, right, about that's hate speech, you can't say that. Placing enforcements and limits on speech. And a lot of critical theorists who are progressives will openly admit that they're very critical of our classically liberal order and the systems and structures that it upholds, including the various rights and freedoms that we have. So depending on whether or not you vibe with liberalism, that might be a weakness. Anything else? This is obviously going to vary in other parts of the world as well, right? Progressives, say in Iran are not going to look the same as progressives in the US, right? And the same thing with conservatives. Progressives in Seoul are not going to look the same as progressives in Pittsburgh.
When was that shift where classic liberalism, in my opinion today, liberalism is progressivism and conservatism is Republican, what he was saying, how it kind of shifted.
So in political theory, the term liberal is normally used to refer to this. And sometimes people in the US who hold these values and policies with a little bit of a progressive bent. The reason why we're talking about, and there is a shift, there's a gradual, a lot of right political thinkers will say that Cthulhu always moves left. And what they mean by that is that the development of human societies always tends towards the progressivistic direction. If you think about, the formation of our country, its founding, and the policies and norms that people uphold now, you might say we are much more liberal than the founding fathers, right? We are accepting and encouraging of all these things that they would not have been. And so I don't think there's a point in time where it happened, but people are often very loose with their terminology. Those who are on the right will call progressives liberals, At least that's how it was 10 years ago. When in fact, really, if we're following these definitions, a lot of conservatives nowadays are the classical liberals, and the people on the left are progressives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the terminology is just so like thrown around. Like.
Yeah. So when you're having these discussions, you're gonna have to like get clear on that with the person. Like, okay, what do you mean by that? Because generally, what it means to be liberal is to like care about this stuff. Thus, yeah, I don't think there was a point in time where the switch happened and the terminology kind of got loose and mixed up. But yeah, a lot of people who are moderate and on the right now hold classically liberal principles. And then it's obviously going to differ because people on the left, just like the people on the right, are not a monolith. And you might even say that way of dividing people up isn't even a good model either, because we could be conservative and progressive on various social and economic issues, right? But a lot of people on the left now are critical of this stuff because they see it as instantiating and sustaining inequity, oppression, alienation, etc. Which is why I kind of wrote this here. That a lot of progressives nowadays are anti-liberal. And what that means is not that they're not on the left, but that, well, they see issues popping up with a free market economic system, which is often associated with liberalism. They see issues with that. They see issues with, complete freedom of speech. And they see, the consequences of liberalism, and they're like, that's bad. We need to address those and get rid of those, which might require more government regulation of the market, which might require the formation of other laws, for example, limits on free speech, limits on freedom of movement, right? If we want to bring up the COVID thing again. But yeah, these terms, lots of people use them very differently, right? And even when people will be criticizing capitalism, for instance, they're not going to all mean the same thing by that. The way that I've always understood capitalism is private ownership of goods, services, capital, and the means of production. But some people, when they say capitalism, they might mean the free market, which is a different thing. It's associated with the capitalist system that we have, but okay, so good. We've got some of that down. I'd like to say just one more thing about conservatism and progressivism here. We characterized conservatism as an ideology which is cautious and resistant to changing the socio-economic order. It's often accepting and encouraging of the current system. But what's interesting is that a lot of conservatives will be resistant or want less governmental intervention in economic and social life. For example, a lot of conservatives don't want the government regulating the market so much, right? But you might say, with regards to private life, conservatism sometimes advocates for maybe more intervention in those things. For example, think about the issue of abortion, right? Whereas a lot of progressives are going to hold the opposite views. There should be more governmental intervention in social and economic life and less, if any, governmental intervention in private life. To talk about abortion again, right? Or gay marriage. let's talk about one more ideology before we get to socialism, communism, and anarchism. Let's talk about libertarianism. Is this a word you've heard? Libertarianism. What do you think it's focused or centered around? It's kind of in the word.
Like lack of government influence. I guess, yeah, like liberty, like just freedom.
Right, exactly. Yeah. You see the root liberty in there, right? Yeah. Libertarians generally advocate for the least government intervention necessary in our system. Libertarianism prioritizes freedom, individual liberties, in decision making, and people deciding how they want to live. And generally, libertarianism doesn't think it's the government's job to solve social issues. So, I think a good phrase that kind of goes along with this ideology is hands off. You know, just kind of let people do what they want as long as they're not violating the rights of others. It is primarily an ideology about government involvement in private and public life. It's associated with thinkers like von Mises, who we mentioned before, Hayek, Robert Nozick, who wrote, what was it? Anarchy, something, Utopia. Famous book. Like classical liberalism, you might say its strengths are like, look, there's more individual freedom and liberty in a system like that. People can do what they want. Generally, or at least in principle, it would be tolerant of people's views and lifestyles, right? Do what you want, believe what you want. I don't care as long as you're not, messing me up or preventing me from doing what I want to do. But of course, like classical liberalism, and you might say like conservatism as well, it has problems dealing with the social and economic issues that pop up as the result of people's individual decisions, right? So, libertarianism cannot effectively deal with economic downturns, right? The inequality that results from the kind of economic system that we have, monopolies. And you might also say it's unable to deal with environmental issues, because primarily it's an ideology not about fixing things, but letting people do what they want and think what they want. So, we'll say it prioritizes freedom, hands off, tolerant, etc. We've gotten now to two ideologies that are talked a lot about in the U.S., right? Socialism and communism. I'm going to classify these as socio-economic. They're both social theories and economic theories. And there is a difference between them. They're used synonymously often in the U.S. when people talk about this stuff. But I'm going to highlight the difference between them that was formulated by Karl Marx in his historical materialist view. I'm sure this is a thinker you've heard of, Karl Marx. One of the views that he had was that the way that we should understand the development of society and history is by looking at the material conditions of communities. Who has access to the means of production? Who has access to the resources? Because he thought that people's psychological states, their physical states, their life paths were all determined by the material conditions of the society in which they lived. Do they have access to capital? Do they have access to the resources? Do they own any of the land? That is what is meant by material conditions. And in his view, he traces the history and development of human societies through various social economic stages. So, According to his view, he hypothesizes that early human societies were primitively communistic. People shared, they looked out for one another, they worked together to get stuff done. We could say then that eventually human societies, a lot of them transitioned into a more feudalistic order in which there was some sort of class divide between the haves and the have-nots, the serfs or the peasants and the aristocrats being the ones who owned the land and employed the serfs, who then had to give, a large portion of the profits and the resources, back up to the landowners that they worked. Eventually, a lot of societies transitioned into a capitalist order. And this is where Marx spends a lot of his time analyzing Western society and Western economies. And he says what we see in capitalist systems is, again, another split between classes. We have the bourgeoisie, those who own the capital, who own the companies, the CEOs, the business owners, the landowners. They have more power and control over what happens than the proletariat or the working class, who are forced to sell their labor power for wages, and they're alienated and oppressed as a result. And what he hypothesized was eventually the working class in these capitalist societies would realize how shitty they have it as their wages would decrease, as they'd have less and less, as they'd have less leisure time to do what they want, being beaten down by the capitalist order and feeling more and more alienated. Revolutions would start occurring in these capitalist countries. The proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie, and they would become the new rulers. In some places this did happen. There were communistic revolutions. But a lot of thinkers who were coming after Marx, namely the critical theorists who emerged in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1920s, who developed what is known as critical theory, a lot of them were Marxist, but they were looking around and they were like, why aren't there all these revolutions happening in these capitalist countries? Like, the U.S. is going strong. What, do they like their capitalism? What's going on? And what they realized and began arguing was economic criticism, it would not be enough to get these places to change and get the working class to rise up and overthrow their oppressors. So they shifted from economic critiques of society to cultural critiques. And they argued that why are these systems still around? Why are people living within them? It's because the culture that these people live in reinforce and support the system. So the media that the people are being fed, the norms and the values, words, concepts, language that these people used are conditioning them to think that the capitalist system is acceptable and good, that they should support it, and that they should work within it. And so, what Marx hypothesized would eventually happen is there would be revolutions in these capitalist countries, and then socialism would be instantiated. What is socialism? Well, we can say it's a socio-economic ideology in which there isn't private ownership of the means of production anymore, but something like public ownership of goods and services. The people own the stuff, but there is some sort of centralized government or authority that carries out the will of the people in dividing up the resources, deciding what's going to be produced, who works, what hours they're going to work. And it's an ideology which is centered around equality of outcome, right? Everybody gets what they need, everybody gets their needs met, we all work together to get stuff done, and the will of the people is carried out by some centralized authority. Thus, socialist thinkers have talked about many different kinds of ownership: public ownership, cooperative ownership, community ownership. So there are different flavors of socialism. We could say it's associated with thinkers like Noam Chomsky, Trotsky, Tolstoy. In any case, what differentiates it from capitalism is this idea that no individuals shouldn't own the stuff and have the freedom to decide what to do with it, but we should all own it together, and we should all decide what we're going to do with it and what's going to happen. What are the strengths of this view? Well, there'd be a lot of social safety nets for people, right? Ideally, if we're all working together, if we're all looking out for one another, people aren't going to slip through the cracks. There isn't going to be inequality, ideally, because everybody's going to get what they need, everybody's going to contribute to the socio-economic order. There are tighter regulations on the economy and safeguards in human life. You might say this results in a fairer distribution of wealth. And hopefully equality of outcome is produced. Everybody gets what they need. Now, what are the weaknesses with this? I suppose if we look at the history of the 20th century, we could see some weaknesses.
It's pretty unrealistic that people are going to actually want to share their wealth too.
And get on the same page and work together. Yeah, so maybe you might say, this is an ideology that's fit for smaller communities, but maybe not on the scale of communities that we have now. Yeah, you could say that. Okay. I'll write down unrealistic, but maybe it depends on the scale that we're looking at it from, you know. Maybe if you all move to the forest with your friends and you live in a hippie commune, you know, you could all share and it would be good and you all love each other and you're on the same page. I don't think you're going to get everybody in the U.S., for example, on board with this, right? In relation to classically liberal countries, which are often capitalistic, we might say that there's less freedom. Why? Well, you have to work certain hours, you have to give your wealth back into the big pool that's going to be divided up among everybody. In practice, too, I mean, we could look at China or the former Soviet Union. Those places aren't known for their liberties, right? So we could say in practice, the people in those countries have less freedom, unless you happen to be one of the people at the top who's deciding how the wealth is distributed, and you keep a lot for yourself, and then you get to do whatever the hell you want, and that's nice. Conceptually, what Sell mentions is capitalist systems have this strength in which they are constantly innovating. Well, we might worry that in such countries, the quality of goods will be worse. And generally that's true. I mean, if you went to the USSR, when socialism was instantiated there were like 3 shirts you could choose from to buy. They didn't have the same number or diversity of goods, same quality of goods. One criticism or weakness that has been leveled against socialism is, like, look, it's not going to be efficient in its production as capitalist systems. Historically, what we've seen is the standard of living in these countries is not as good compared to capitalist countries like the US. And you might also say, like, look, it's simply impossible for some sort of centralized authority to manage a large-scale economy, like intentionally, consciously. They would have to set the prices of goods, decide when those were to be raised or lowered, decide how much to produce, decide what gets produced, all that stuff. And there are examples that we could find historically in which, like, people were working all day to produce nails that were then just melted down, and then they would, unbeknownst to them, use the same metal again the next day to make nails that nobody was using. And it's like, okay, what's the point of that? That's inefficient. And we could talk about, the violation of the rights and the peoples of the countries who have tried this, and all of the historical injustices that are associated with that. So what is the difference between this and communism? Well, according to Marx, after societies instantiate a socialist system in which everybody's getting along, we're all sharing and working together, eventually, once people got used to this and people learned to love this and do this and care for each other, the state, the centralized authority, would just wither away. And the people would just be living in this way, but they wouldn't need some sort of authoritative body to enforce it. People would just do it naturally. So you could think of Marxist communism, for example, as just socialism, but without the state. There's no state, there's no government. It's just people sharing and living together and caring for one another. It's an ideology historically that has advocated for class warfare, public ownership of goods and resources and the means of production, like socialism, and the withering away of the state. In practice, a lot of the countries that we call communistic historically were actually socialistic, because they did have some sort of governing authority regulating all of that. The withering away of the state did not occur, for example, in the former Soviet Union or in China, right? They have a strong centralized authority there. So people call China communistic, it would be more appropriate to call it socialistic, with some capitalist elements as well as they're opening up their market. This kind of ideology can be seen in the philosophy of Marx, Lenin, Stalin. Although, you could also put this guy here because he was a part of the socialistic order. And so what are the strengths of this view, of this ideology? Well, it sounds really good on paper, right? Everybody gets what they need. Everybody cares for one another. There's no government breathing down your neck. If we could all get on the same page and work together, everybody would get what they need. Marx is famous for saying, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So, again, there's no inequality, ideally. There's equality of outcome. Everybody gets what they need. Again, fair distribution of wealth. There are safety nets because everybody's caring for each other, all that stuff. Strong community. This means, the same, these two lines. And people are free to do what they want, right? Well, in practice, it hasn't really worked out that way. In practice, the people living in these socialistic or communistic systems did not have the freedom and the loving sense of community. For example, in the former Soviet Union, people did not trust one another. Why? Because everybody was seen as an agent of the state that was going to snitch on them if they said anything bad about the government or about the communistic order they were trying to achieve. So you might say it's unrealistic on this scale. There was less freedom for those people. We could talk about, the gulags, the historical injustice, the death, the starvation, the human rights abuses, all that kinds of stuff. And finally, let's just talk about anarchism. What is anarchism? Anarchy! What is that? Is that death and violence in the streets? You're like, maybe, but that's not what it's supposed to mean. What's it supposed to mean? Does anybody know?
Govern ourselves without an official government.
Right, yeah. Get rid of the government. Get rid of this hierarchical organization. Get rid of the authorities breathing down your neck. Let people live how they want. A lot of anarchists also advocate for get rid of laws. Let people associate with whom they want to associate, do what they want. There will be certain, norms and principles the anarchists say everybody should follow. For example, the non-aggression principle. But yeah, it's closely associated with libertarianism, right? You might say it's a more radical form of libertarianism where it advocates getting rid of the state, the government, totally. It's associated with thinkers like Emma Goldman. I don't know if Max Stirner was an anarchist, maybe. Proudhon. Yeah, in essence, anarchism is an ideology which advocates for the abolition of hierarchical government and advocates for the organization of society based on voluntary association and cooperation. It's critical of government, critical of government power, of laws, all of that stuff. And there are many different kinds or flavors of anarchism. You could be an anarcho-communist. You could be an anarcho-capitalist. You could be an anarcho-syndicalist. So we could call this a social ideology in which, it can be kind of paired up with a bunch of the other economic ideologies. Anarcho-capitalists are going to say private ownership is the way to go. Everything should be decided by the market. Anarcho-communists are going to say, that's stupid, private ownership. Nah, we got to get together, look out for one another, share, distribute the stuff. But we shouldn't have any laws making us do that. We should just do it. So it's kind of a flexible social ideology, right? And so what are the strengths with this? Well, freedom, right? People could do basically whatever the hell they want. There's no government surveying you or breathing down your neck, looking at your search history, right? No CIA. You might say everybody in a sense is on a level playing field because there is no hierarchical organization. Insulation from governmental power because there is no government. All right, level playing field here. Of course, it has its weaknesses, though. What are some of its weaknesses? You might say it'll become chaotic, right? Like, okay, if we dissolved, let's do the Hobbes thing again. If we dissolved the government and law enforcement and all authority, yeah, what would happen? You might worry it's going to turn into the purge. So some people think anarchism would produce violence and chaos. But not everybody, right? I mean, it depends on your view of human nature. So maybe chaotic. If there is no government, there's going to be no authority regulating human life or protecting others. If we lived in an anarcho-capitalist system, you'd have to pay for your own protection. Right? Maybe that would be a good thing, maybe leaving it up to the whims of the market would provide better bodyguarding services than anything the government could do. Maybe, I don't know. But there's no guarantee of any social safety nets, right? You're on your own, unless you happen to live with people in some sort of informal community. And you might worry that such a way of organizing ourselves would be more insecure than we are now. Right? Because if there aren't any social safety nets, well, let's say you get hit by a car in the anarchist society and you have a disability now. How the hell are you going to feed yourself? Is any government employee going to come and help you and take care of you? No, because there are no government employees. There's no government. So, I don't know, maybe more insecure life in some ways. And then finally, we could talk about fascism. Generally, this is something that not a lot of people support. It's characterized generally by nationalism. Usually in fascistic countries, there is a strong centralized governing authority. In a lot of these places, there was totalitarianism. Strong suppression of opposition, authoritarianism, violation of people's individual rights and liberties. The poster boys of this ideology to be like Mussolini and Hitler, right? And usually in such countries, there's like a merging of state and corporate power. Okay, so I did a lot of talking, but sorry. So these are just some of the ideologies that we might believe in, advocate for, try to get our society to follow. What do y'all think of them? Is there anything we missed? Is there one that you gravitate more towards than the others? Sure, yeah.
I don't think there's anything you missed. I just think that most places, especially now, aren't pure, any of them.
Correct, yes. Yes, we should write that down. Most countries are a blend of these various ideologies. For example, in the US, we have some socialistic policies and we have some capitalistic policies. In some ways, we are libertarian. In other ways, we are conservative and progressive. So almost. I don't think you'll find a country that is a pure any one of these. Just as, progressives nowadays, for example, might say true communism has never been tried, true capitalism has never been tried in the US. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. So yeah, what you're going to find is there will be a blend of these kinds of policies and institutions. What do you think about them? Is there one that you like? One that you think that we should work on making a part of our lifestyle and how we do things here? Or no, you're just like, I don't care. I just want to play Star Wars Battlefront. I don't care about any of that. My vote doesn't matter anyway. Maybe you do believe that. Yeah.
I mean, I sort of agree with Rousseau how, like, I believe, like, rational thinking, like, self-interest would be sort of a collective interest in a way. Like, I think, like, I kind of agree with anarchism because I believe that if, like, there is no oppression and there is no, like, scarcity, I feel like rationally there would be no need to, like, have greed and, like, irrational self-interest, because I think...
Do you think scarcity is, like, an artificial thing? Like it's created in some sense by...
I think it's normally started off, like, in the state of capitalism, I think it normally starts off as, it could be, like, propaganda, but I think that whole idea, that panic, that crisis, like, it creates scarcity. Kind of like with COVID and, like, toilet paper. Like, we didn't really have, like, a scarcity, but, like, we created one.
And people were buying enough toilet paper that they would never go through in their lives, right? Yeah. Yeah. Were you just going to talk about the toilet paper thing? Or?
Oh, no, I wasn't going to. I was just laughing.
Oh, yeah.
It's true, yeah.
Yeah. Or hand sanitizer or whatever else. Okay, so you lean kind of towards, ideally, the anarchist view. A little bit. Okay. What do the rest of y'all think? Yeah.
I think what the U.S. currently has now with a heavier mix of socialism, I think capitalism and socialism has worked out somewhat okay, but with a heavier mix of socialism, I think it would turn out better.
Like some of the Scandinavian countries?
Yeah.
Perhaps, right? Where they do have, you might say, more robust, wider social safety nets for people. And they give their workers some more privileges than we have, right?
I think that comes, though, with, I think a lot of the United States, I think we purposely make our social programs fail, and which is why I think we have the Red Scare, but with socialism in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we had a ability to completely undermine how our government currently runs social programs, and then made them like the Scandinavian social nets, where they're actually, treat their citizens with respect and try to give them any support they need, then I think that capitalism and socialism would mix fine.
Okay. So yeah, you'd like to see more socialist policy, perhaps. Yeah. Anything else? It's anyone's guess where we're headed, but
I feel like capitalism is gonna eventually collapse in a few like I don't want to say a few years, but sooner than later, because I've learned in other classes that capitalism is built to basically collapse in on itself.
Marx thought that, look, over time, the contradictions and tensions within capitalism would, inevitably lead it to self-destruction. And then a new social and economic order would emerge. Yeah.
Because we're already seeing the harmful effects of overconsumption, right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's going to have to change, or we're all going to be poor.
If you really want to trip, and this is the last thing I'll say, look into accelerationism. Have any of you heard of that? There are different sides of this, but a lot of accelerationists believe that, there's so many problems with capitalism. It will break and implode eventually. And that's going to be, bad in some ways, but good in a lot of ways. So what we need to do is accelerate that process. And so lean into the capitalist system as hard as you can so it'll implode faster. So go out there and buy. Buy. Produce more scarcity. Sell. I don't know. It's a fun little view. Anyway, thank you for coming. If you have any questions or concerns, email me. Otherwise, I'll see you on Monday. Read the Machiavelli piece, and we'll talk about that on Monday. I'll change the syllabus to reflect our schedule.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.